IDC Radio.
בינתחומי.
106.2 FM.
106.2 FM.
Greetings. We are here at the IDC International Radio Studios for a jointly sponsored interview on behalf of the American Society of International Law's Interest Group on Law and Technology with Dr. Daphné Richemond-Barak. She's assistant professor at the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. She's the author of this book, Underground Warfare, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press, and addressing the fascinating, important, and timely issue of the use of tunnels in conflicts. So good to have you here once again, and we'll start with our first question. So your book and research is really notable for addressing an innovative and important topic with interesting and innovative legal analysis as well. Could you give us some background on how you came to this fascinating topic and whether there was a triggering event or development that drew your interest in the topic and drew you to write the book?
So thank you all as well for joining us and listening to this conversation. There was a triggering event.
Okay.
It's a very interesting question. Something happened in October 2013. Israel uncovered a cross-border tunnel emanating from Gaza, dug by Hamas, and getting close to the kibbutz of En HaShlosha in Israeli territory. And I think unlike previous tunnel incidents, I would call it, that Israel encountered over the years, that one made the front page of the papers. And
why was that?
So that was because it was probably the proximity to the civilian populated areas and maybe the willingness of the Israeli authorities, for whatever reason, I'm not sure what that was, to actually be more open about it and share the information. And so I ran across that and I thought to myself, very interesting. I'm an international lawyer and I deal with the use of force, international humanitarian law, and I started asking myself questions about what is this underground warfare thing? Has anybody written about it? Does the law even acknowledge it in any way? What were the historical precedents? What is the state practice? So I started kind of asking myself a lot of questions. Ultimately, my research went way beyond the law to also analyze some strategic and operational issues, but the trigger was the law.
That was the trigger. Mm-hmm. So on that last point that you just mentioned, in some of the discussions we've had, you've pointed out that that underground warfare can be very surprising and unexpected. And that's one of these innovative points that is really, I think, interesting to shine some light on. So why is it surprising? Why is it something that is unexpected?
So the tunnel is invisible by definition, and that already creates an element of surprise. A lot of the effort behind the digging of a tunnel is to conceal, to surprise. It's almost like its intended purpose, right? But what is quite remarkable is beyond this, the inherent feature of the tunnel, which is invisible and surprising because that's its objective. For some reason, tunnel users have been able to surprise again and again, and in a variety of contexts, and it keeps happening. And you think that after a certain amount of time or a certain amount of experience, the receiving end of that tunnel would get used to it and anticipate. But no, the tunnel always works. And then I can give you very different examples coming from very different horizons. It goes from the bank robbery to the El Chapo escape from prison. It's of course Israel discovering this tunnel at the border with Gaza. And it keeps happening. And so why do tunnels manage and succeed to surprise every time and again in different forms, in different modalities, different contexts, but yet so having too much confidence in the realm of tunneling is probably not a good thing. Yeah, not wise.
That's really interesting. It leads directly to what most of us need to learn about from you, which is what tunnels are and how they get there, and under what circumstances are they dug, and how long does it take, and what are some of the more technological difficulties of digging one's way under the earth?
So tunnels can take very many forms and are dug for a variety of purposes. And I think in terms of trying to conceptualize this for my analysis, I basically zoomed on two main characteristics of tunnels. One of them is where the tunnel are dug. Are they dug, or where the tunnel is dug? Is it dug on the territory of a single state, or is it dug cross-border? So for international law, that has obvious consequences. Right. I think that that have to do with violations of territorial integrity, which we may talk about later on. But so that's my first factors in terms of conceptualizing for the purpose of analyzing, and also for the purpose of assessing the threat, because ultimately policymakers and national security experts want to assess the level of threat that these tunnels pose. Right. So that's one factor. And the other one is how close do they come? It also has to do with location in a way, but how close do they come to civilians? So that would enable us to make a distinction between the tunnels of Mali and Afghanistan, dug by Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda elements in the mountains, in mountainous areas far away from civilian centers, and where basically the state that is launching anti-tunnel operations can legally do many things because the civilians are not likely to be hurt as a result. And tunnels that come, and in contrast to that, the tunnels of Gaza or Aleppo that come very close to civilian areas. And I think those two elements enable us to think about tunnels in a little bit more structured fashion.
Okay, great. Now, the inevitable pun or attempted pun that I just have to make. So let's drill down a little bit into, sorry.
It's okay.
I'm
used to these jokes.
Give us some specifics in terms of the technologies used to dig. What's the state of the art for tunneling these days?
There's a variety of technologies that are being used. So far, no foolproof technology has been found to deal with tunnels, and I want to drill down a little bit more on that. Because each tunnel is different, it's not just different in terms of its location, but it's also different in terms of its features and how it is dug. Is it dug in hard rock? Is it dug in soft sediments? Is it fortified with cement and so on? Does it have wires, which very much influences the type of technology that you'll be able to use to detect the tunnel? So it's not like you can point to one method or one technology and say, okay, this is the technology that is going to help states detect tunnels in all circumstances. And that's part of the complexity of the problem, that there isn't one method or one technology that will be able to do this in a perfect manner. The anti-tunnel efforts must be tailored to the type of tunnel that is being searched, that is suspected as to exist. And in addition to that, I want to add that the technology, however important, and it is very important. And we've seen that very recently with Israel's operation in the Lebanese border, where Israel was able to detect cross-border Hezbollah tunnels. So technology does matter, but it's not the whole story. And in a realm of underground warfare, it's extremely important for states fighting or contending with this threat to combine major technological advancement, yes, but with new intelligence gathering techniques that are, again, tailor-made to this specific threat, and that involve, for example, visual intelligence, analyzing the topography, knowing when you have some kind of like a temporary building suddenly coming up on the map, that this might be a place where the earth is being excavated, or human intelligence, training people like the U.S. does at the Mexican border to identify signs of ongoing digging. If you see something suspicious, and telling them what would be something that is suspicious, report it to the authorities. So it's not just the technology,
so
no matter how important.
We might even use the word hybrid kind of security threat. That needs to be dealt with, as you're explaining to us, with hybrid methods and lots of
holistically.
Yes,
it has to be holistic in its approach, and it would be a mistake actually to focus all the efforts on the technology.
Right, that's really important. I want to draw us into the legal issues a little bit. So probably the best starting point, or perhaps the clearest starting point for our listeners, is the context in international law into which you have done your analysis. So talk to us a little bit about collective security and how underground warfare and the digging of tunnels specifically comes into this entire context. What are some of the problems? Where is it easier to analyze all of this kind of activity within the law that we have, the Lex Lata?
So I definitely want to talk about the law. Maybe I just want to make one point that hasn't come up in our conversation so far that I think is important for our listeners at home, and I think that's the kind of like very spread out nature of this threat, because not all our listeners might be aware that there are really tunnels. I mean, I did mention Mexico so far. I mentioned Israel, Gaza, and Israel, Lebanon, but there's also Egypt dealing with tunnels emanating from Gaza, and of course, a very significant use in recent years by ISIS of the underground, both in Syria and in Iraq, and even reportedly at the Syrian-Turkish border. So I think that's really important to understand that we're talking about a very fast-spreading threat, primarily among non-state actors, terrorist groups, and so on. And again, we may touch upon this later, but I think that's quite important to say. And I think since we're talking in a context of this, the interest group of the American Society on Law and Technology, I do want to make clear that the reason why this tactic of war, which is not a new tactic of war, but it's re-emerging and it's becoming increasingly popular on the contemporary battlefield, the reason why it's spreading has everything to do with technology. And I want to really talk about this before we talk about the law, because it's important to understand. It's basically the high tech, the highly sophisticated capabilities of the U.S. Army, the French Army, the Israeli Army, the Canadian Army, that has pushed those non-state actors underground. So it is the high tech that has created the impetus for the low tech to become so prominent, and that has made the underground so attractive, even though there's a lot of effort that goes into digging a tunnel. So you asked me earlier, how long does it take? It takes a huge amount of time. We're talking about weeks to dig a few meters. So why put on so much? The human cost is very high. There's collapses and accidents all the time. Diggers can lose their lives very easily. And again, so there has to be a huge value. And there is a huge value. It's incredibly attractive. And that's because of the technology. Because once you're underground, you basically have neutralized all the technological advantage and of your opponent. The asymmetric warfare no longer exists. That concept becomes irrelevant. So that's really, I think, an important element.
That's absolutely interesting and on point. And I would add to it your earlier comment about the element of surprise, which is really just it's hard to surprise countries or militaries that have at their beck and call the highest cutting-edge technologies.
Totally, and I'll give you an example of that. So
and here's exactly the example of a low-tech surprise to high-tech technologies. It is exactly
what's happening. And, so the French forces in Mali, they were following these Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb elements in the mountains of Mali, and suddenly they could not hear them on the communication network. And they didn't understand what happened. Did it disappear? Did everything get cut off? But all they did was to go underground. But that surprised the French and Chadian forces because they couldn't hear anything anymore. And they didn't really understand where that was coming from. And I think maybe another point that links into international law. Typically, the way it works is that international law follows the technology, and it's the advancement in the technology that kind of like forces international law to adapt. Here, we see something very different. We see the low-tech forcing international law to ask some questions.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So that's also interesting.
That's fascinating. So let's get to the law.
Yeah.
Okay. There are lots of other questions, but let's get to the law and your legal analysis of how this all fits in with contemporary international law. And if you're willing to go up to the edge and over it a little bit of the Lex Ferranda, where would you see the law like to go once you've completed the analysis of the Lex Lata?
So the question of the lex ferenda is a good one. As a matter of principle, I'm typically not. Although I do research quite heavily, developments on the contemporary battlefield, I don't think I've ever argued in favor of new law. And here it's the same thing. So even though I advocate a much greater understanding of what underground warfare is and the extent to which it affects the whole of the conduct of hostilities in such deep ways, I don't advocate the enactment or adoption or creation of new laws. I think we have international humanitarian law. We have, in the case of the ad bellum, which is also relevant to tunnels. There's no need for new laws. There's a need for acknowledging a very different terrain, a very different reality that changes war in significant ways. So the lex ferenda, I will leave aside, but I do think it might impact the interpretation of the law in a given case, or again, how you analyze the various elements. Something that, by the way, the United Nations, following a protective edge operation in 2014, the United Nations issued a report to analyze the legality of Israel's action in the Gaza conflict. And it did mention that there were tunnels, but it didn't affect in any way the legal analysis. They didn't resonate. So that's exactly what I want to avoid, in a way. So in terms of the legal questions, does this raise legal questions, new legal questions? And I've been asked this question so many times. Some questions are new and unique. And some questions are questions that are very similar to the type of legal dilemmas that we encountered on a contemporary battlefield in general, but they are magnified by the tunnels, by the underground, the invisibility, the unknown factor. So it's really two types of legal issues. And perhaps I should preface this by saying that even though tunnels have been part of warfare for time immemorial, I did search quite well in international legal sources and beyond. I searched in historical sources, military history, military theory, and I found nothing. I found extremely little. And so international law specifically does not address tunnels. The few references that you find here or there, one is in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea on tunneling, but it doesn't really go much further. There isn't really even an international law governing the underground, like sovereignty over the underground. Right. So international is quite, silent. So what are the issues? Why did international not say anything? And, we have this Lotus principle, of course, that says, whatever international law doesn't regulate, then it's permissible. So I started with that premise, right, which is a very kind of classic, I think a bit old-fashioned.
Could you talk, I'm slowing us down a little bit, just to, if we could take a small or small or medium, turn down the path of the sovereignty question, and then we'll come back to the use of force and self-defense and preemptive self-defense in this context. But a little bit on the sovereignty question, because it's absolutely fascinating to think about where that line is of territorial integrity violated where underground. What's the legal thinking in terms of where those lines are drawn?
You're talking about the depth of the sovereignty?
Exactly.
So that's a question again. So international law regulates land sovereignty. There are various dimensions that are being addressed very heavily. Regulates maritime sovereignty. The law of the sea is quite a developed body of law at this point. Space law, which you're familiar with, is in also has some ambiguity about where exactly sovereignty ends. And so with the underground, there's even less than in the realm of space law, I would say. It's even less explored, and it's only a question of sometimes mentioned in relation to aquifers or water resources or exploitation of resources in general. So international law does not regulate this. And so part of what I've tried to do is to think about the guiding principles that govern sovereignty in general and try to apply them to the underground. For example, the demilitarization or the prohibition to militarize the use of the underground. So putting a nuclear weapon underground, these are principles that are quite prominent in international law that I think would be equally applicable to the underground. But again, in terms of the depth, I think here it's a function of technology to a great extent. States will want to maintain sovereignty so far as they can access the underground, and after that, it might just be it matters less to them. Same thing with the sea and same thing with space. Right. So I think here technology plays a major role, and we're likely to see an evolution as we've seen in maritime, in law of the sea, and as we've seen in space law. Yeah.
So let's go with the easy case. So the tunnel's not so deep. And we know that it crosses a territorial border. When is the collective security regime implicated? I know I want to get to the heart of the matter, and what can states do? What is state practice, or where are the directions in which state practice goes in terms of responding to the use of tunnels?
Okay, so we're talking about cross-border tunnels. I think it's important to understand that. We're talking in an ad bellum situation, so there's no conflict between the two neighbors, although probably they're not in the best terms. And that brings me to the first very important point, which is when a state discovers a cross-border tunnel at its border, it can pretty much assume that there's a hostile intent behind this enterprise, this tunnel digging enterprise. Typically, neighbors don't dig under the border just for the purpose of just saying hello. So, but I think that's an important point because people might want to get proof of that, and what I want to say is that that's not really needed. Okay, so a cross-border tunnel is a violation of territorial integrity. It's a violation of sovereignty, and of course, for us international lawyers, it gets us pretty much to, we start from scratch because, okay, so what does that mean? Does it mean you can go to war with your neighbor? No. Well, if it has been an armed attack, yes, you can go to war with your neighbor, or maybe as anticipatory self-defense. But just the fact that you found a tunnel may not be sufficient. So we need to ask a lot of other questions like, how many tunnels are there? Do they actually cross the border yet? Have they crossed the border yet? Or are they just getting close to your border, which may also matter? Again, are we talking about an area that has civilians around it in the proximity? What's your relationship with this neighbor, right? With this other state that's digging, or it might be a non-state entity, by the way, on the territory of that state that is digging the tunnel, which complicates the situation to some extent. But so to try to kind of simplify a little bit for the purpose of our conversation, I would think that a state that discovers a number of cross-border tunnels has a right under international law to take action, to take military action, of course, the right to turn to the Security Council and ask for international intervention, but also to take its own actions. And these actions can be limited to anti-tunnel operations in some cases. In some cases, it might be a full-fledged war. But generally, what I would advocate, and after I did this analysis quite in detail and in the book, what I would advocate is that a state could either claim anticipatory self-defense in a situation like this, or
if it sees signs of, as you said before, strange noises under the ground, preparations to dig a tunnel, etc. So we would go you'd go in the direction of anticipatory.
Exactly. If something is imminent, then that would give rise to anticipatory self-defense. But I would also suggest perhaps a more unusual theory of this, using the plea of necessity of Article 25 of the draft Articles on States' Responsibility, and there are conditions for doing that. But I think that might justify as well a very limited incursion into foreign territory to only deal with the tunnels. Here, my policy purpose here is to avoid the war, the full-fledged war, and to deal exclusively with the tunnel and take a measure on the territory of the state just directed at these tunnels, eliminate them, do what has to be done, get out. And I think that international would support that. There's a lot of discussion and debate over whether Article 25 and the plea of necessity can be used in situations involving the use of force and the incursion into foreign territory. I think this hasn't been completely ruled out. So I believe that this is something international would support. But again, what is interesting here is that when we look at state practice, in this specific case, think about North Korea. Okay, so North Korea is digging tunnels into the territory of South Korea. Did South Korea go to war with North Korea? No. Did South Korea destroy all the tunnels that it discovered? No. So, and even Israel in the latest operation, Northern Shield, at the Lebanese border with the Hezbollah tunnels, Israel did not enter Lebanese territory. So here I think we need to think about the law, what the law enables a state to do, and then ask ourselves, okay, there are a whole lot of strategic considerations that come into this decision, obviously.
And what are states choosing to exercise in terms of their rights, and what are they not choosing to exercise? That's really interesting. To complicate matters a little bit in terms of the legality and the legal analysis, talk to us a little bit about the combination of a wall or a fence having been constructed, and whether it matters in terms of your legal analysis, whether the tunnels are dug under such a wall or under such a fence. Does that affect the legal analysis? And in general, what's the relationship between these border walls when they're constructed and tunnels that are dug underneath them?
So this is a very timely question, of course, very relevant, I think, to the potential building of a wall at the Mexican border. And knowing how many tunnels there are at the Mexican border, I really wonder what is the usefulness of a wall, and setting aside all other political considerations. I'm looking at it exclusively from the lens of tunnel warfare. But given, and this is what I mean by being cognizant of the reality, the likelihood that this wall will be circumvented by a tunnel is very high. And in fact, I'm not
this
only
is the U.S.-Mexico wall
U.S.-Mexico,
under construction.
So I'm not only skeptical about above ground walls, but I'm also quite skeptical about below the ground and underground barriers, so-called, which that would bring us more to the context of Israel. Unless these walls are equipped with sensors able to detect the digging of tunnels either in them or under them, then they are useless because they don't prevent this. And this is a very tangible way of overcoming the obstacle. In fact, there are reports that Egypt dug an underground barrier a few years ago, and that within a few weeks, Hamas was able to just dig through it. So unless you have those sensors, and here's where you need the technology really, I don't think that this would really work.
Okay, so that combination of walls and tunnels is doesn't necessarily affect the legal analysis. It's just in terms of the practical benefits of building a wall. The thinking needs to be different. And I just want to reiterate your point, because this is interesting. Underground barriers don't necessarily solve the problem either.
They don't.
So tunnel warfare still remains a problem, even if whether the wall is above ground or underground.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a really important point to know. It brings us to a whole different area of questioning that I'd like to explore with you, and that is the state actor, non-state actor context. So who tends to build tunnels underground? Who tends to use them as a part of their warfare or of their military activities, and who opts not to do so?
So I conducted, I guess, a quantitative study or empirical study of using New York Times archives, and I looked for all instances in which the New York Times reports mention tunnels in conflict, not transportation tunnels. And because I wanted to confirm some of my intuitions about the trends. And I think this is what you're asking, right? Who uses these tunnels? Maybe you also have other questions about what kind of tunnels, for what purpose do parties dig tunnels? So here's the conclusion. There's a clear, and again, it's not highly scientific because the New York Times is not everything, but it gives an indication.
Direction.
Exactly. Sure. And it confirms our kind of like what we tend to think. So non-state actors, right? Terrorist organizations, non-state actors have become almost exclusive users of tunnels, with cross-border tunnels being on the rise. And this is, of course, mainly happening since 2001, post 9/11, and also mostly in the Middle East and Asia. So those are the trends, and what that means is that primarily Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and etc., but other actors as well. Okay, so mostly non-state actors use the underground. Are there any states who still use the underground or still dig tunnels? I think it's not using the underground. We have to be specific. Who digs tunnels? North Korea and Syria. Because Assad's regime was faced with the rebels and with ISIS digging the tunnels. So he did the same thing that happened in World War I. When he saw Assad that his enemies were digging tunnels, he went underground as well. But besides North Korea and Syria, states have refrained from digging tunnels already for a long time. There's a certain stigma that attaches to underground warfare. And you can't really imagine at this stage Canada, the United States, Australia, France, the United Kingdom, digging tunnels and sending soldiers in them. That doesn't seem very real.
For offensive purposes. For defensive purposes,
Exactly.
All bets are
So
off, I
what
assume.
they do, okay, so they don't dig tunnels for the purpose of fighting and so on, like the non-state actors do. However, it doesn't mean that they don't make any use of the underground. And here they use their capabilities, their sophisticated military and technological capabilities to dig major structures underground, what is known as deeply buried facilities. And there they have command and control centers for times of emergencies, potentially nuclear war, and they preserve also their elite, right? The political elite.
Right.
They want to have hiding spaces, and they want to have
Underground passages.
and so on. And so all states that I'm thinking of here are Russia, Iran. Again, the ones I mentioned before, Canada, the United States has it. Israel has an important underground structure as well. So it's not. This is why the nuance here is important. It's not that only non-state actors make use of the underground, but non-state actors and states make very different use of the underground, which is a function of their capabilities.
Very interesting.
But yet, it's important to be reminded that you wouldn't expect soldiers. No one expects soldiers to fight in those underground, deeply buried facilities. And by the way, speaking about technology, a lot of the technology that is being used today to detect tunnels was initially developed, including by DARPA, to find those deeply buried facilities. So there is a connection between the two, but they are very different.
And interesting questions, I think, of targeting, if we're thinking of ostensibly, or at least initially, these underground facilities, a fascinating topic in and of itself, I'm sure, are being built for defensive purposes or as reinforcements or as shelters to a certain extent. I think this raises really interesting questions of targeting. So how does one start to think in terms of the technology and the law of eventually targeting such critical facilities, which they are? We're keeping, in effect, the crown jewels are going underground in a lot of states in terms of what you're describing. So there's probably a deterrence effect to the knowledge that comes to light. Here we go again. It's inevitable, isn't it? These kinds of
the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. So we should get all that out of the way. But how, in your mind, how do you think about the presence of these underground facilities in terms of military postures and targeting eventually, and technologies that are developing either on the part of states or non-state actors as well, to eventually target such facilities? Is that something that's on the horizon at all?
So targeting. Look, when we're talking about deeply buried facilities, I think there are military objectives. I mean, that doesn't really leave a lot of questioning, I don't think, because they are obviously they answer all the requirements. I mean, targeting, they contribute to the military effort. Neutralizing them would definitely brings you closer to military advantage and so on. So I think that's fine. And in terms of the tunnels, which is a more complicated story, do they constitute military objective, is one of the questions that I really explore as kind of like an IHL question. And ultimately, my conclusion is that looking at the definition of military objective, tunnels, just by virtue of their location, actually, they already, because of their strategic location, which is underground, just like a hill can constitute a military objective because it's a hill.
Right.
So a tunnel, because it's a tunnel, could already be considered a military objective. I think that's a little bit too broad, so I do the analysis for the additional criteria, and I get to the conclusion that in 99% of cases, when you have a tunnel on a battlefield, right, in an armed conflict, and it could be in a non-international armed conflict or an international armed conflict, the likelihood that it's going to be a legitimate military objective is very high, and therefore, at the policy level, and I guess also from the point of view of the law, it's very important that civilians get out of those tunnels, right? It's true that sometimes you have shelter, so of course that's one of the 1% exception, and you have to be very careful as a military commander. But at the same time, it's really important to understand that just like a military base is a military objective by nature, a tunnel doesn't maybe get as close, but it's pretty close. And this is why civilians must be kept away from them, because they are dangerous and they are amenable to anti-tunnel operations and to strikes. And so not a good idea to put civilians in them.
So we're nearing the end of our time, unfortunately. This has been absolutely fascinating and raises all kinds of questions about where we're going with technologies and appropriate and laws that, as in your view, are still serving us in making analyses of these new situations. Any additional points that you'd like to add in terms of educating all of us about this really intriguing use of state territory to wage war or to wage hostile activity?
Look, maybe I'll raise what I think might, to some extent, be the elephant in the room, right? The question of whether, if technology gets better, maybe, we won't have tunnels anymore. Maybe this threat will be eliminated if states really are able to come up with the technology that would solve all the problems. And here, I would say that there have been in recent years significant advancement in terms of technology, and this has been prompted by mainly two factors. Interestingly, in the United States, it's the prospect of a war, involving North Korea that has prompted the United States to really rethink their tactics and their techniques to deal with the subterranean environment. Not Vietnam, not ISIS, not Al Qaeda, but North Korea. And in 2017, the United States issued a circular addressing these issues. What ought soldiers wear in an underground environment? What is the equipment? How do they, in what kind of the type of formations that they will adapt? What are the rescue operations like? So a lot of details, but a very important about procedures, but a very important adaptation to this environment. So that prompted not only a thinking about, of course, how to do it militarily, but also technologically, how do we detect tunnels and so on. So North Korea was a huge prompter in my view. And of course, Israel with its very, which is once again serving here as a lab, right? Creating special units, finding out technologies, algorithms that are going to help it overcome this. And so we do have advances, and the question is, does that mean that it's going to be the end of it? I doubt it, and I think maybe that ends us on a quite pessimistic note, but at the same time very real one, which brings us back to the beginning by saying that tunnels have always managed somehow to surprise the receiving end of them, and so assuming that this is going to end now would be, I think, a mistake. And I think particularly if I can call attention to one aspect, it would be counterterrorism operation. I would think now, get out of the conflict zone, think about peacetime, and think about tunnels. And that's where I see a major challenge going forward, where technology in and of itself will not be the only solution to it. So probably the threat is here to stay, at least for a little bit longer, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for your words of wisdom.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And for your wonderful book.
Thank
you, once again, we have, here it is, Underground Warfare, published last year. Get a hold of a copy. It's really worth reading. Again, Daphné Richemond-Barak, we're here at the IDC International Radio Studios, co-sponsoring this interview, the American Society of International Law's Intergroup on Law and Technology. Thank you all for being with us. And
thank you for
your
listening.
time and your attention.